Cynical here, the skeptic of skeptics, trying my hand at a video walkthrough on my take of Toby's latest pop at Vaccine Efficacy on the Daily Skeptic. His pet political philosopher, Will Jones, murders data science again, and it's worth understanding how. At the heart of it, Toby's trying to pretend that the unvaxxed are all uninfected, a brave, freedom-loving cohort who are sticking it to the vaccine zealots by showing them that they're almost as good at dealing with the virus, making vaccines pointless. But reality, as I'll show, is far from this version of the truth. Here's the article in question. They review PHE's Technical Briefing 23 and conclude vaccines are reducing cases by 7 to 24%. An astonishing claim. Now, their duplicity, or confusion, is best summarised in their title, which paints the situation as vaccines becoming less effective, rather than considering that the membership of the unvaxxed cohort might have been changing over time. So, what is this Technical Briefing 23? Well, it's this document that PHE produce, and specifically what they underpin all of their analysis on is this table here, which looks at cases under 50 and over 50, and also deaths in a similar way, broken out into different categories for the counts that have been gathered from various data sources that are available. And this includes, most interestingly, those that have been double dosed and those that have been unvaxxed. Now, what they do is they subtract from Briefing 23 the data from similar data from Briefing 17 to get the change in the data over the last 2 months. And they say that they're doing this because they want to pull out just Delta's effect on the whole situation. And having done that, what they then do is try and form a sort of ratio or a relative benefit for vaxxed versus unvaxxed. So here we can see for the over 50s, they take the delta, or the difference the last 2 months, they divide it by the percentage vaxxed, and they do the same for the unvaxxed, and then they form a ratio of one over the other. And they do a similar thing for the under 50s as well. Now, the sort of key numbers out of their calculation, which are worth taking note of, are these percentages that they believe are unvaxxed. So for those over 50, it's 9%, and under 50, 55%. Now, what's interesting about the way that they've approached this piece of analysis is that PHE also produce this report, which is a rolling, the most recent rolling 4 weeks of data, and it's very similar to what they produced, looking at the last 2 months. Now, their implicit argument for not using this data set, because they don't even mention it, is that they're trying to consider only Delta cases. But in the last 4 weeks, Delta cases have been 99.5% of all cases. So it doesn't make any sense. And the reason why I think this would probably be a better data set to use is not only is it more recent, or concentrating on more recent data set, but it also breaks down the data into a much more granular set of age ranges. And very importantly, it also adds these rates, which allow us, as I'll come on to show you, to have a look at potentially what PHE think the various population sizes are that are at play here. So if we pull out the cases and deaths from this more granular data set that PHE produce into a spreadsheet, we can start to have a look at trying to sort of unpick what Toby's been up to. And here is the raw data that's come out of that most recent PHE publication. And immediately what we can see, or what jumps out at me, is that the rate that they produce per 100,000 of cases and deaths in the unvax, but more specifically the cases, seems to vary quite a lot. Those under 18 have 3, maybe 4 times the rate of cases as those in the 80s. Now, you'd expect that. Younger people move around more, they see people more. But if we look at the vaxxed rates, we see that effect playing out in a slightly more expected way, sort of 50% higher spread rate in those 18 to 29 than those 80 plus. So we get a sort of first indication that there's something potentially a bit funny going on. If we form a ratio of these two and look at it across the different age ranges, this jumps it out as even more. The rate under 18 and in the young is two to three times more likely to have a case if you're unvaxxed than vaxxed. And we know, if we think about it, we know that there are more even sizes in the vaxxed and unvaxxed cohorts in these lower age ranges. But as you get older, the number unvaxxed is now quite a small number. And when you're forming relative rates, if you've got a very small group versus a very large group, if you have an error, it's more likely that that error will become significant when you try and form a relative rate, which is maybe why we might be getting some of these odd sort of inversions of this rate, where it appears to be the case that you're better off unvaxxed than you are vaxxed as the age groups get older. So something seems amiss. If we try to recreate the 7 and 24 numbers that Toby had from the sort of 2 months worth of data in this more recent 4-week data set, we can see here that we're getting similar numbers, 40%, 49% more likely to have a case under 50, and in fact less likely over 50. And this sort of continues the slide if we go back here to look at the narrative that they were running in the article, where they note that in the over 50s it was 7.6%, but 2 weeks before that the same count was 15%, and 2 weeks before that the count was 24%. It looks like as we come to the most recent 4 weeks, this drops below parity and actually looks worse for the vaxxed than it does for the unvaxxed. Now, if I was Will, looking at the way that data has been moving around over quite a short period of time, I wouldn't be thinking that vaccine efficacy must be decaying very rapidly. I'd be thinking something must be changing about these sets of data that I'm not understanding, that's causing these effects. And before I start prophesizing about the world, I should probably try and understand that. So, in order to try and get a little bit more of a handle on what might be going on, my first thought is, well, can we get some understanding of how big they think the populations are that are involved in the unvaxxed cohorts? The reason why that strikes me as a more interesting thing to investigate is that we've got pretty accurate data from NHS England on how many people have been vaxxed. What we don't have in any population really is dramatically accurate population estimates for the number of people that there are at different ages. There's migration effects. You can't rely on birth certificates, all these sorts of things. So knowing exactly how many people there are in each of these age ranges is something that is estimated. So the advantage of the more granular data set that we're looking at was that it had a rate per 100,000. And in fact, if we use that and the unvaxxed total cases, we can back out from that an estimate of the unvaxxed population size that would have, that PHE think is at play to create the rates that they've shown us. And in fact, if we do the same for deaths, we can see that we're getting very similar numbers. So the population estimates that PHE using are consistent between their cases and their deaths. And in fact, if we go and look at their website, we discover that they're using the National Immunisation Management System's estimate of these population sizes. So how does this compare to the ONS's estimates and if and a sort of cross-reference of the ONS estimates against vaccine rates. Well, I also went and downloaded the ONS population estimates and also NHS England's vaccination data. And if we subtract one from the other, we can get an estimate that the ONS thinks are unvaccinated. And if we just take a ratio of one over the other, we can see that we're actually getting quite a range of values. And in fact, this plot here tries to show this graphically. I haven't included the under 18s just because the number's so huge it'll throw out the scale. But we can see here ONS, NIMS, and then the green line here on the axis over here is the ratio. And we can see that for those 50 to 59, NIMS has got 2.7 times the estimate for the size of the unvaxxed population. And in fact, the peak of the sort of difference happens in the middle age ranges. And if we think about how that might play out in the data set that Toby was using, where he's sort of keen to show us a sort of total for those under 50 and those over 50, these far lower rates in the unvaxxed, if they are happening as a result of an error in the estimate of the number of unvaxxed people, you're going to have these sort of skewed estimates offsetting these more accurate estimates where the populations are more in line, getting sort of totaled up into the under 50 and the over 50 totals that Toby's using. So it's sort of conveniently allowing an error to sort of hide reality, which is sort of my, and I'm being a bit cynical, but there we go. It just strikes me as odd that they've decided to use a data set which might be hiding an error and diluting the reality of the situation. Now, what does all this mean? Well, it means that the reality for the unvaxxed sort of percentages, if we believe the ONS dataset, is that the totals under 50 and over 50, which we've almost managed to recreate here that Toby was using in his calculation, are actually very different when we consider the ONS datasets, which means he's sort of overestimating the sizes of the unvaxxed population, which will be diluting these rates and making the unvaxxed situation look better. But there's a bigger issue than even having an error in using the right sort of population estimate that's going on in this whole calculation. And that bigger issue is that ultimately what Toby's implicitly saying when he tries to compare vaxxed and unvaxxed is he's saying if you develop your own immunity rather than getting the vaccine, how well do you do? And this is a little bit of a lie, really, because we know that roughly 25–30% of the population had immunity from infection before vaccines started to spread. And in fact, if we go and download the ONS antibody study data, which I've done here, and we try and look for each of these age ranges at what the sort of percentage of the population, what percentage of the population in each of these age ranges had immunity prior to vaccines, adding prevalence for antibodies, we can start to form some estimates of what proportion of each of these populations might have been immune to start with, before vaccines could have an effect. Because of the way the vaccine programs rolled out, younger age groups have had more of a chance to develop infection-based immunity because vaccines have come later. And we can see this blue line here for those 16 to 24. I looked up the dates for when vaccine efficacy would have come into effect for that age range, and we can see very visibly in the chart where it happens. And we can and the reality is that in that age range, about 50–55% of that cohort had infection-based immunity before vaccines could even have had an effect. And if we trace back through, trying to sort of find the same estimate for each of the different age ranges, we come up with these estimates that I've come up with here. It becomes a lot more difficult to do as the age ranges get older, because you're crashing into quite high infection rates happening at the same time as the vaccines were being rolled out in sort of January and February. But I've made conservative estimates for what I think the infection-based immunity would have been in these age ranges, based on looking at the mortality rates in the first wave and the second wave, which is roughly 2 times as many deaths, and how much immunity had been built up in the first wave. You can use that to estimate what the likely natural immunity rate would have been in these older populations, which is what I've done. Anyway, taking those percentages, I've basically popped them in this column here, and this is a floor, or a sort of minimum for the percentage of either cohort, either the vaxxed or unvaxxed, that would have had immunity at the start of the vaccine program rolling out. But if we think about it, we know from testing and from the sort of evidence that's built up in terms of the ratios between reports of sort of symptoms, that roughly about a third of people know that they've had infection. So over time, as the vaccination programs are rolled out, what's happened is that or what's probably likely to have happened is, you'll have an entirely unvaccinated cohort, and people who aren't sure that they had an infection are probably more likely to get vaccinated, pulling themselves out of this unvaxxed cohort. And as the size of the unvaxxed cohort gets smaller and smaller and smaller, you're going to get more concentrated proportion of that unvaxxed group of people having immunity from infection, because they know they've been infected, and they're just less likely to get a vaccine. So what I've done here, based on the sizes of the unvaxxed percentages left in each of these cohorts, is estimated what I think is likely to be the percentage of the unvaxxed group that have immunity from infection. The reason for doing this is we want to try and form a sort of total of number of people that we think are truly unimmune, because these are the people that we actually want to compare to, and we want to ask the question: what is the benefit of having immunity either from a vaccine or from infection immunity? What advantages does that give you on reinfection and surviving? So from that, we can then form these totals here, which cut down this ONS-based estimate of the unvaxxed even further. And we can see that, that we're getting quite high ratios of the denominator that's been used in this rate. We can see that how much bigger this estimate of the unvaxxed population size is over the true unimmune collection of people that are probably creating a lot of the cases and deaths that we're seeing in the data. So that has quite a big effect. I mean, if we look at it, we're essentially saying that rather than them being the 22 million-ish unvaxxed people that Toby's using in his calc, and rather even than there being the sort of 17 million, if we correct that using the ONS estimate, there are in fact probably only about 6.5 million people left in the country that don't have any immunity at all. So is this all the potential errors in interpreting the PHE dataset accounted for? Well, when I was looking to cross-check the unvaxxed population size estimate against the ONS, I noticed that the error in the two oldest age groups wasn't anywhere near as large as it is in the middle age groups. Yet the ratio to the vaxxed rate is still similarly low. So if there's not an error with the denominator, it's possible that there is an error with the numerator. So in this case, the number of unvaxxed people that we're actually counting. And my eye was immediately drawn to this unlinked column, where the unlinked number is twice the size of the unvaxxed number in the very old age groups, but it's only 10% in the youngest age groups. In fact, this column over here is that ratio. And when I investigated what this unlinked status is, it's basically PCR tests that can't be related to an NHS number because they're being done anonymously, so therefore can't be connected to a vaccination status for that NHS number. That said, it's not going to just be people that are being the people that are tested anonymously are not going to just be people that are also unvaxxed, because there are a very small percentage of people who are vaccinated anonymously. But if we consider the 290,000 double vaxxed cases, if we've got a sort of 2%, say, percentage of those that are vaxxed that have done so anonymously, and these cases are distributed reasonably randomly, we'd be looking at perhaps 2% of cases that are coming up would be in those that had vaxxed anonymously, and we might expect those that had vaxxed anonymously to also be testing anonymously, which would mean that we'd be looking at sort of 5,000 to 7,000 people who have cases that are in this unlinked status, which would be about 10% of the unlinked that they've measured in total, which would suggest that about 90% of the unlinked are in fact unvaccinated. And this would make some sense if the 98% who have vaccinated and identified themselves with an NHS record are very likely to identify themselves with an NHS record when they are tested. So it seems to me that it's entirely possible that in these two older age groups, we're looking at the true unvaxxed numerator being about 3 times larger, which would treble this rate and certainly correct an awful lot of the error that potentially we think we're seeing in this ratio. So if we combine all of this thinking together, the sort of corrections for population error, the adjustments to actually try and pull out those truly unimmune, and also including those that are unlinked, we can come up with a new total for those that we truly think are unvaccinated. And I also include in that total half of those that are only 1 to 20 days from their first dose, because some proportion of that group will also still be unvaxxed from a perspective of vaccine efficacy not having taken effect. And we can come up with these new totals. Having done that, we simply divide that unvaxxed estimate by our new population estimate for those that are truly unimmune. And all of a sudden we can see that we're getting a much higher rate of cases in this sort of whittled down data set. And if we look at the ratio of that to the vaxxed, we can see that the ratios have jumped up to between 8 and sort of 14 or 15. And if we look at the total, it's looking far more in line with the 90% vaccine efficacy that trials were seeing, because it's looking like 10 times as many people who are unimmune are developing cases. And in fact, if we apply all of the same thinking to the death data down here, so make the corrections, we can see that from a fatality perspective, it is far more fatal to be truly unimmune. In fact, the population weighted sort of average is about 37 times more, but because of the elevated risk in the old, you're looking at it being about 55 times more fatal to be over 50 and to be truly unimmune. So we can see here that it's possible with a data set like Toby started with, without doing a lot of rational logical thinking, sort of tire kicking essentially on that data set, to come up with some observations about the data as they've done in these sort of totals that they're tracking, that are not really reflecting the reality of where you get to if you actually sort of try to ask, what is the real question that we're trying to ask here? And that real question is, what is the benefit of being immune over unimmune? Which leaves me stunned, really. I mean, why has none of this thinking happened in the analysis that Toby's doing? Why is he not keen to answer the question in a sort of in-depth and honest way? And I return to the article. For me, there's a reasonably obvious sign of what might be going on here. What is the true motivation for the articles that are being formed? And I don't want to be suggesting that Toby might be doing this to make money and to drive a sort of contrarian narrative, but it seems pretty duplicitous to me. It's entirely possible that they're just not mathematically and from a data science perspective experienced enough to be getting this right, but there are some very big open questions about the motivation of what's led to an article that's essentially trying to present a situation whereby vaccine efficacy is getting worse, and there was really never any real benefit to be getting vaccinated over being unvaxxed. Sort of entirely skating over and hiding the reality that because of the concentration effect that's been happening in the unvaxxed cohort, the reality of the comparison that they're making is that you've got two groups that are roughly similarly immune now, if you're looking at the more recent data, because vaccine rates are so high, and that's concentrated where those with knowledge of infection have ended up. I just find the whole thing pretty sinister. Anyway, that's my take on this article, and hopefully it's given you an insight into how I think through these sort of things. I'll speak to you soon.